Bourguignon is a classic French stew that is made of beef, mushrooms, onions, and red wine. It's one of those French dishes that has gained a reputation for being fussy and fancy and difficult, but it doesn't have to be. The version of Boeuf Bourguignon that we will be making today is more rustic. It's the version that my mother taught me and that she learned while growing up on a farm in the south of France. By the end, however, it will look and taste anything but rustic. Boeuf Bourguignon, or beef Burgundy in English, is a stew, and all stews follow the same general formula, or 5 basic steps. 1. Brown the meat. 2. Sweat the aromatics. 3. Add in spices and thickening agents. 4. Add in your liquids and the meats back into the pot. And 5. Simmer for a long time. If you follow these 5 basic steps, you will always end up with a good stew. Any additional steps like straining or blending the sauce, adding in ingredients that are cooked separately, or having a special topping or garnish are ultimately stylistic choices. You do not technically need to do them to have a great dish by the end. So if this is your first time making a Boeuf Bourguignon, feel free to start with this recipe, and then as you grow, you can get as fancy as you want. Boeuf Bourguignon was never intended to be a fancy recipe. It is made using cheap, tough cuts of meat. But those cheap, tough cuts of meat have tons of flavor. It takes longer to cook them, but you get more reward. And in the case of the Boeuf Bourguignon, you get a rich sauce and meat that falls apart in your mouth. When you're shopping, look for a package of stewing meat that has nice marbling and a good amount of fat in it. During the slow cooking, that fat and connective tissue will dissolve and render into the meat, leaving it tender, not tough and dry. Baking soda is my secret weapon for browning meat. Browning meat is the result of a complex chemical reaction called the Maillard reaction. The baking soda is going to help to prepare the surface of the meat so that it encourages the meat to brown faster. The salt is not only going to season the meat, it's also going to help draw out the moisture. And the less moisture there is on the meat, the better it will brown. A lot of recipes tell you to start with cooking pork fat or bacon when you begin making a Boeuf Bourguignon. But the point is not actually to have cooked bacon by the end, it's to render out the fat and use that to brown the meat. So I'm skipping that and I'm going to be using Schmalz, which is pork fat, and very easy to find in grocery stores here in Vienna. If you can't find Schmalz, however, you can always use butter or vegetable oil. Fat is far more thermally conductive than air or water, meaning it is helping the browning process along. We are essentially shallow frying the meat here. Browning adds flavor and brings another powerful layer of umami to the table that would not have been there beforehand. The trick to browning is to leave the meat alone. Patience is the hard part here. These are our aromatics: carrots, onions, and garlic. The value of the aromatics is in what we can extract from them, not necessarily the ingredients themselves. We are looking to draw out those flavorful oils and compounds from the vegetables, rather than the flavor of carrot or onion itself. The key here is not to brown the vegetables, but to push the water out of them in the form of steam. That's why we say we are sweating the aromatics. That process is going to concentrate the flavors in those vegetables, which will add another layer of flavor to the base of our dish. It's time to start building on the flavors that will form the body of our dish. We have tomato paste, anchovy paste, and dried mushrooms, which all have umami qualities that will build on the umami from the browned beef and give our stew that satisfying meaty flavor. The bay leaves, Dried herbs and pepper are going to add complexity and an earthy, herbal quality to the sauce. And lastly, fresh mushrooms. Button mushrooms don't have much flavor, but they will give the flavor that they have to the sauce and to the meat. These mushrooms are more about adding texture to the finished dish. Mushrooms have a high water content, so we are going to let them release some of their water and then add in the other ingredients. The interior of this pot is really hot right now, so as soon as these ingredients hit that environment, the heat is going to start drawing out all of those flavors really effectively. As soon as we add the liquid, however, it's going to drop the interior temperature, which is why we want to do this process before we add the liquids into the pot. Adding flour helps to thicken the stew as it cooks, but there are several ways in which you can add the flour and several times during cooking in which you can add it. I like to add it in at this point because it helps to prevent the flour from clumping and leaving you with a lumpy sauce. The two main liquids making up the sauce of a Boeuf Bourguignon are wine and beef stock. The wine that you choose here does not need to be expensive. Please do not waste your money buying a super expensive bottle of wine for cooking with for a Boeuf Bourguignon. A pleasant but drinkable, inexpensive wine will turn out just as good at the end of this dish as a super expensive wine that blows your mind. If you're unfamiliar with wine, I would suggest looking for an inexpensive French or Italian table wine. Okay, here's my confession. I love stock cubes. Of course, a homemade beef broth is always going to taste better, but I don't usually have time for that. And I have a small kitchen, so keeping cartons of pre-made beef broth on hand is not practical for me at all. Stock cubes take up way less space, they're inexpensive, and they're a reliable way to add depth of flavor to my cooking. You want there to be enough liquid to cover the meat, so if it's looking a little low, add some more water until the meat is covered. As your Boeuf Bourguignon cooks, the liquid is going to be reducing. So don't worry about the levels going down or the sauce getting thicker. That's exactly what you want. What you don't want is for the meat or the pot to start looking dry. After about 1.5 or 2 hours, you should be able to start breaking the meat apart with just a fork. Boeuf Bourguignon is usually paired with potatoes, either boiled or mashed, or a good crusty baguette. I like to pair it with a baguette and a salad with a vinaigrette dressing to help lighten everything up. When I'm developing recipes, there are 4 criteria I'm mentally rating the dish on. How easy is it to find the ingredients? How expensive is it going to be? How simple will it be to make it? And is this something I can scale up and use to feed a crowd of people? So here's how I would rate this dish. All of these ingredients are easy to find in a well-stocked grocery store. You might need to do a bit of hunting for the anchovies or the dried mushrooms if you don't usually buy that sort of thing, but the store will almost certainly carry it. For a dish that features red meat and wine, this is not an expensive recipe. You could end up spending more, however, depending on the wine you choose to buy. There's several steps to making a Boeuf Bourguignon, but they aren't hard. All the work is done up front, so you will probably only spend about 20 to 30 minutes actively cooking when making this. You can easily double this recipe, make it ahead of time, freeze it, etc. Like most stews and soups, it's just going to taste better the longer the flavors are allowed to meld. It's a brilliant dish for entertaining or feeding a big group of people. Hit like and subscribe for more recipes and videos, and I'll see you next time.